The ringing in my ears was louder than the chiming of the old grandfather clock in the hall. It was a high, thin sound, the kind that scrapes along the inside of your skull. My daughter-in-law, Amelia, stood before me, her hand still hanging in the air, a pale, trembling bird that had just done a terrible thing. "The keys, Eleanor," she hissed, and the sound was frayed, torn at the edges. Her eyes, normally a warm, placid blue, held nothing but scorched panic. "Give me the keys to the Buick." My cheek throbbed, a hot, blossoming shame. I was 82 years old. I had survived the Great Depression as a child, a world war as a young woman, and the slow, quiet grief of widowhood for the last 2 decades. In all that time, no one had ever raised a hand to me. Until now. In my own living room, smelling of lemon polish and the potpourri I kept in a crystal bowl on the mantel. My son, David, lunged forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "Amelia, for God's sake. What are you doing?" He tried to grab her arm, to pull her back into the realm of reason, but she shook him off with a strength I'd never seen in her. She was a petite woman, a yoga instructor who spoke of balance and inner peace. There was no peace in her now. She was a live wire, sparking with a terror so profound it had become a weapon. "Stay out of this, David," she snapped, her eyes never leaving mine. "She knows. She has to give them to me." What did I know? I knew that the Buick Roadmaster, a hulking land yacht from 1972, sat under a dusty tarp in my garage. It hadn't been driven in 5 years, not since my Robert passed. I knew its vinyl seats cracked in the summer heat and that it smelled of his Old Spice cologne and stale cigar smoke. I knew it was a relic, a monument to a man and a time long gone. But I didn't know why it was worth this. This ugly, violent fissure in the heart of our family. I said nothing. The shock had frozen the words in my throat. I simply stood there, my hand rising slowly, instinctively, to the stinging print on my cheek. I watched her. I had always been a watcher. Robert was the actor, the builder, the man who moved the world to his will. I was the observer, the one who saw the subtle shifts in a person's eyes, the tightening of a jaw, the lies that hid behind a confident smile. And what I saw in Amelia wasn't malice. It was something far more frightening, desperation. The kind of desperation that chews through reason and spits out the bones. David tried again, his voice pleading. "Honey, please. We can talk about this. We can figure something else out. Don't do this to my mother." "There is nothing else," she cried, a single, hot tear finally breaking free and tracing a path down her cheek. "Don't you understand? He's not going to wait. He wants the car. Now. He." The word hung in the air, a shadow falling over the floral wallpaper and the framed photos of happier times. A nameless, faceless he had reached into my quiet life and turned my daughter-in-law into a stranger. Her gaze darted from my face to the small ceramic bowl on the entryway table where I kept my keys, the house key, the mailbox key, the key to the garden shed. But not that key. The key to the Buick was in a different place. A safer place. Robert had always been a man of precautions. "Never keep all your eggs in one basket, Ellie," he'd say. It seemed he was right. Seeing my unresponsiveness, Amelia's frantic energy finally broke. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ugly sound. She looked from me to her husband, her face crumbling. Without another word, she turned and fled. The front door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Silence descended. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the steady, judgmental tick-tock of the grandfather clock. David stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He couldn't meet my eyes. "Mom," he whispered, the word barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what's gotten into her." I finally lowered my hand from my cheek. The skin was tender. I looked at my son, my only child, a good man with a gentle heart who had his father's looks but none of his steel. I saw the shame in his eyes, the fear he was trying so hard to conceal. I walked past him, my movements stiff, robotic. I went to the large bay window that overlooked the driveway and the closed garage door. It was just a door. But I knew what was behind it. Not just a car. Not just steel and chrome and faded paint. It was a time capsule. A vault. And I, it seemed, was its keeper. The question wasn't what had gotten into Amelia. David left a few minutes after Amelia did. He mumbled something about finding her, about making things right, his words fumbling over each other in his haste to escape the suffocating silence of the house. He didn't look at me as he left. The shame was a wall between us. I was alone. I stood by the window for a long time, watching the empty driveway as the afternoon sun slanted across the manicured lawns of our quiet Charleston suburb. My cheek had subsided to a dull, persistent ache, a physical reminder of the crack that had just appeared in the foundation of my life. My world was a place of careful order. It was a fortress built of routine. I would wake at 6, listen to the birds for a spell, then tend to my roses. They were my pride, peace roses, with creamy petals edged in the softest pink. I knew the precise angle to prune each stem, the exact moment a bud was ready to unfurl. After that, coffee and the newspaper, followed by letter writing on my pale blue stationery. My life was measured, predictable. It was the armor I wore against the sharp edges of loneliness. Today, that armor had been pierced. My gaze drifted to the garage door. Behind it sat the Buick. The Beast, Robert had called it. He'd bought it brand new in '72, the year David graduated high school. It was a behemoth of American steel, navy blue with a white vinyl top, ostentatious and utterly unapologetic. It was Robert, condensed into a machine. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A hot summer evening, years ago. We were driving home from a dinner at the club, the windows down, the thick, humid air smelling of jasmine and low tide. The V8 engine rumbled, a deep, contented purr. Robert had one big hand on the wheel, the other resting on my knee. "This car, Ellie," he'd said, his voice full of the easy confidence that had first drawn me to him. "It'll outlast us all. It's built proper. Solid. Like us." He squeezed my knee. "No matter what happens, you'll always be safe with me. I'll see to that." A promise. One of many. Robert was a man who built things, houses, a business, a reputation. He built our life with the same methodical determination, laying down a foundation of security and prosperity. He was a good provider, a respected man. But he was also a man who kept rooms in his life locked. I knew there were deals made on handshakes in dusty construction sites, whispers with men whose names were never mentioned at the dinner table. I never asked. It was part of the unspoken contract of our marriage. He would build the walls, and I would make the home within them. I would not question the quality of the mortar. Now, that fortress felt like a prison, and the ghost of its architect was laughing at me. What had he done? What secret had he sealed away in the upholstery of that old car, a time bomb set to go off decades later in my quiet living room? Amelia's desperate face flashed in my mind. He wants the car. Now. Who was this he who could inspire such terror? And why did he believe a rusting relic held the key to anything? I turned from the window. The house was too quiet. The ticking of the clock seemed to be counting down to something. I walked through the living room, my fingers trailing over the cool, smooth surfaces of the furniture. Everything was in its place. The porcelain shepherdess on the mantel, the family photos on the side table, David as a boy in a baseball uniform, Amelia and David on their wedding day, a smiling, sun-drenched couple. It was a life curated to look perfect, serene. A lie. I stopped in front of a framed photo of Robert and me, taken on our 40th anniversary. He stood tall, his arm around my waist, a proprietary hand. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I had always known that about him. His eyes were the locked rooms. For 20 years, the Buick had been a monument to my grief. A 2-ton headstone I couldn't bear to part with. I would go into the garage sometimes, lift the corner of the tarp, and run my hand along a fender, the cold metal a conduit to the past. It was an act of remembrance. Now, it felt different. The car was no longer a symbol of my husband. It was a symbol of his secrets. It wasn't a relic, it was a piece of evidence. And the panic in Amelia's eyes told me that the trial was about to begin. I went to the kitchen and put on the kettle for tea. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. Not anymore. The shock was receding, and in its place, something else was crystallizing. A cold, hard resolve. My roses could wait. The letters could remain unwritten. Robert had made a promise to keep me safe. He had failed. Now, it was up to me. The days that followed were a masterclass in avoidance. David and Amelia moved through my house like ghosts, their presence felt more in their silences than in their words. They had returned together late that first night, Amelia's eyes red-rimmed and puffy, David's face set in a grim, exhausted mask. There was an apology, of course. A stammering, hollow thing from Amelia that I accepted with a quiet nod. Accepting an apology and accepting the lie behind it are two very different things. They said it was stress. A business deal gone sour, pressure from investors. They painted a vague picture of financial trouble, the kind of trouble that made people short-tempered and irrational. They hoped I would see the slap not as an act of aggression, but as a symptom of a temporary illness. They wanted me to be a sweet, forgetful old woman. They underestimated me. I became a student of the cracks in their facade. I watched the way Amelia shredded her napkin at the dinner table, her fingers never still. I saw how David's smile never reached his eyes when he asked if I needed anything from the store. They were performing a play of normalcy for an audience of one, and they were terrible actors. The house, once my sanctuary, became a listening post. My hearing might not be what it once was, but my attention was sharper than ever. I'd sit in my reading chair in the evenings, a book open on my lap, my eyes on the page but my ears tuned to the frequency of their anxiety. I learned to distinguish the sound of Amelia's restless pacing in the room above from the house's normal creaks and groans. The phone calls were the worst. They spoke in hushed, frantic tones, always retreating to the back porch or their bedroom, closing the door not quite all the way. Their whispers were like venom seeping under the door. I couldn't make out all the words, only fragments, disjointed and sharp. Another extension, that's all we're asking, David's voice, pleading. He laughed, David. He just laughed. Amelia's, brittle with despair. One night, I couldn't sleep. A restless energy had settled deep in my bones. I went downstairs for a glass of warm milk, my slippers making no sound on the thick hall runner. As I passed the living room, I saw them. They were sitting on the sofa in the dark, illuminated only by the cold, blue light of a cell phone screen in Amelia's hand. They thought I was asleep. I flattened myself against the wall in the hallway, my heart a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. Her voice was a raw whisper, stripped of all pretense. "We don't have that kind of money, Thorne," she choked out, her voice cracking. "We just don't. We've sold everything we can. The stocks, my mother's jewelry, there's nothing left." David's reply was a low murmur I couldn't catch. "It doesn't matter," Amelia continued, her voice rising in pitch. "It's not about the money anymore, don't you see? He'll take everything. The house, what's left of the business. He knows about the Buick. He thinks Robert." Her voice broke into a quiet, desperate sob. Thorne. The name wasn't a shout, it was a cold, metallic clang in the deep well of my memory. It wasn't a name I had heard in years, not since Robert was alive. It belonged to the world of those locked rooms, to the whispers I had chosen to ignore. A name associated with steel dust, concrete, and a deal that had ended badly. I couldn't place the face, but I remembered the feeling it evoked in my husband, a grim satisfaction, like a predator who had successfully defended its territory. Standing there in the dark, clutching the cool wall, I understood. This wasn't a new problem. This was an old debt coming due. My son was paying for the sins of his father. And this man, Thorne, believed the payment was parked in my garage. I retreated back up the stairs, my quest for milk forgotten. I lay in my bed, the sheets suddenly cold and foreign. The gentle, predictable rhythm of my life was gone. The foundation Robert had built wasn't solid rock, after all. It was built on a fault line. And the tremors had just begun. The whispers had given me a name. And a name was a place to start digging. The next morning, I woke before the sun, not with the gentle drowsiness of age, but with a clarity that felt sharp and dangerous. The woman who had cried herself to sleep was gone. In her place was someone I hadn't known for decades. The young wife who had learned to balance Robert's books, who could spot a padded invoice from 10 paces away, the woman who knew that survival was not a passive state. I was no longer just a resident of this house. I was its custodian. Its keeper. And that included every secret it held. My first act of rebellion was small and silent. After my coffee, while David and Amelia were still asleep, I went to the entryway table. The ceramic bowl was there, filled with its meaningless keys. I walked past it, into the small den where I kept my sewing basket. Underneath a tangle of threads and spare buttons, my fingers found the cool, familiar shape of a single, heavy key attached to a faded leather fob. The Buick key. Robert had given me this spare years ago. For emergencies, Ellie. It seemed the emergency had finally arrived. I didn't hide it somewhere obvious. I walked out to the garden, to my prize-winning peace roses. Near the base of the oldest, most thorn-covered bush, I knelt, my old joints protesting. I dug a small hole in the soft, dark earth with my trowel, wrapped the key in a piece of oilcloth, and buried it. The soil felt cool and final as I patted it down. Let them tear the house apart. They would never look here. My second act was to confront the beast itself. I pulled the cord for the garage door, and it rumbled open with a geriatric groan, flooding the space with pale morning light. There it sat, under its gray shroud. It looked like a sleeping animal, huge and dormant. The air in the garage was still and smelled of gasoline, old rubber, and time. I pulled back the tarp. The navy blue paint was dull with a film of dust, and a few rust spots bloomed along the chrome trim like age spots. It was bigger than I remembered, a relic from an era of cheap gas and boundless optimism. For a moment, sentimentality washed over me. I saw Robert behind the wheel, his arm resting on the open window, a grin on his face. Then I banished the ghost. This wasn't a memorial. It was a puzzle box. I opened the driver's side door. The groan of the hinges echoed in the quiet garage. The smell hit me immediately, that unique cocktail of old vinyl, stale cigar smoke, and Robert's cologne. It was so potent, so visceral, it was like he was sitting right next to me. I slid onto the cracked vinyl seat, my hand resting on the huge, thin steering wheel. For 20 years, this car had been a symbol of my past. Now, I had to see it as a map to my future. Where would a man like Robert hide something? Not in the glove compartment. Too easy. Not under the seats. The first place anyone would look. He was smarter than that. More patient. And then I remembered. It wasn't a fully formed memory, more like an echo. A Saturday afternoon, maybe 30 years ago. He was tinkering with the car, something he rarely did. I'd brought him a glass of lemonade. He was on his back, halfway under the dashboard, a screwdriver in his hand. "What on earth are you doing, Robert?" I'd asked. He'd grunted, sliding out. There was a smudge of grease on his nose. "Just a little custom improvement, Ellie. A private security box. For important papers. You never know." He tapped a spot on the underside of the dash, just to the right of the steering column. "Don't you ever forget where this is." I had forgotten. For 30 years, I had forgotten. My heart began to beat a little faster. I leaned over, my body stiff and awkward, and angled myself to look up under the dashboard. It was a dark, confusing tangle of wires and metal. I ran my fingers along the rough underside, feeling for anything out of place. My fingers, thinned by age but still nimble from years of sewing, traced over a smooth surface that didn't belong. A small, flat metal plate, no bigger than a postcard, held in place by what felt like small, inset screws. It was flush with the surrounding metal, painted the same matte black. Almost invisible unless you knew exactly what you were feeling for. A secret compartment. With trembling fingers, I tried to find a latch, a button, a release. Nothing. It was sealed tight. It would likely require tools, and more strength than I possessed, to open. I slid back into the seat, my mind racing. I reached in and tried the latch. It was empty. The small space behind the metal plate was hollow, a vacant cavity. A wave of disappointment washed over me, so sharp it felt like a physical blow. But it was quickly replaced by something else. The fact that it was empty didn't mean it was meaningless. It meant that whatever Robert had hidden, he had either moved it, or someone else had already found it. Or maybe the secret wasn't what was in the compartment. Maybe the secret was the compartment. Its existence was a clue. It proved Robert had something to hide. It proved that Amelia's fears, that Thorne's obsession, weren't born from fantasy. They were rooted in a truth my husband had gone to great lengths to conceal. I sat there for a long time in the silence of the garage, the smell of the past all around me. I was no longer just defending a memory. I was investigating a crime. And my chief suspect was the man I had loved for 50 years. My next target was the one room in the house that was still, unequivocally, his. Robert's office. After he died, I'd locked the door and left it, a perfect time capsule of the man he was on his last day. The family had suggested clearing it out, but I'd refused. "I'm not ready," I'd told them. The truth was, I was afraid of it. Afraid of the silence, of the lingering scent of his cigars, of the finality of an empty chair behind a large oak desk. Now, fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. Knowledge was the only currency that mattered. Under the guise of finally getting around to some spring cleaning, I took the key from the hook in the kitchen pantry. It felt heavy in my hand. The lock turned with a stiff, protesting click. The air that met me as I opened the door was thick and stale, a potent mixture of old paper, leather, and dust. A single beam of sunlight cut through the grimy window, illuminating dancing motes of dust in its path. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. A half-empty glass of bourbon on the desk, a fine layer of dust coating its surface. An open ledger. A silver pen lying beside it. It felt like trespassing. Like an invasion of a very private space. For a moment, I faltered. Then I thought of Amelia's terror, of David's helpless shame, of the slap that still echoed in my memory. I closed the door behind me. I didn't know what I was looking for. A letter? A name? A number? I started with the obvious, the desk. The drawers were meticulously organized. One for stationery, one for invoices, another for blueprints of the houses he'd built all over the Low Country. It was the public face of Robert Vance, contractor. Neat. Orderly. Legitimate. But I knew my husband. He had a public face and a private one. He believed in redundancies, in hidden safeguards. I ran my hands along the underside of the drawers, around the back of the desk, searching for anything taped or tucked away. Nothing. My eyes fell on the bookshelf. It was filled with leather-bound volumes on architecture and engineering, books on local history, biographies of powerful men. Carnegie. Rockefeller. Ford. Men who had built empires, often on foundations of ruthlessness. Robert had admired them. I scanned the titles, then I started pulling them from the shelf, one by one. I shook them, riffled through their pages. Nothing but the dry scent of aging paper. I was about to give up when I noticed it. On the bottom shelf, tucked behind a thick volume on municipal zoning laws, was something that didn't belong. It wasn't a book. It was an old-fashioned accountant's ledger, bound in worn, green leather, much older and more weathered than anything else in the office. It had no title on the spine. It was anonymous. Private. I pulled it out. It was heavy, dense with paper. I carried it to the desk, sat in his high-backed leather chair, it still held the faint impression of his body, and opened it. The pages were filled with his familiar, decisive handwriting. It wasn't a record of the business, not the official one I used to help with. This was something else. A shadow ledger. It was a log of dates, names, and numbers stretching back 30, 40 years. Most of it was cryptic. A single initial next to a dollar amount. A notation like Peer Project, materials expedited. I paged through the years, my heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm. I was peeling back the skin of my own life, looking at the ugly mechanics beneath. I saw the names of city councilmen next to figures that looked suspiciously like donations made just before a big zoning vote. I saw notes about union troubles that mysteriously resolved themselves. This was the mortar he'd used to build our fortress. And then I found it. About halfway through the book, dated nearly 35 years ago. The name was written in sharp, angry strokes, Thorne, Sr. It wasn't just a name. It was an entire page. A series of entries detailed a joint land development deal. The Seabrook parcel. There were figures for investment, projections for profit. For the first few months, the entries were routine. Then the tone changed. My husband's handwriting grew smaller, tighter. T. Disputing material costs. Arrogant fool. T. Meeting with rival bidders. Cannot be trusted. Auditor confirms T. Skimming from equipment fund. Confrontation inevitable. The final entry on the page was stark. It was written in a different pen, the ink darker, as if he had pressed down with immense force. Thorne matter resolved. Permanently. Resolved. Permanently. The words were cold, clinical, and utterly terrifying. They were the words of a man closing a door and turning the key. My breath caught in my chest. I remembered the whispers from my past, fragments of conversations I'd overheard about Robert's original business partner. A man named Leonard Thorne. A man who had died. A tragic accident, they'd said. Fell from the scaffolding on the Seabrook site. A terrible, unlucky misstep. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air of the unused room. I had mourned for Leonard's widow. I had sent flowers. I had held Robert's hand at the funeral as he spoke of his dear friend and trusted partner. It was all a lie. The ledger didn't explicitly say murder. It didn't have to. The implication was a black hole on the page, pulling all the light out of the room. This wasn't just about a bad debt. This was about blood. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a predator circling my son's failed business. He was an avenging angel, or a demon, come to collect on a debt far older and darker than money. And he believed the proof he needed, the final piece of his father's story, was hidden somewhere in that rusting blue Buick. The green ledger felt like it was burning a hole in the polished oak of the desk. Resolved. Permanently. The two words had reconfigured my entire past. The loving husband, the strong provider, the respected community builder, that man was a carefully constructed fiction. The real Robert Vance was a man who wrote sentences like that in a secret book. Panic is a rising tide, if you let it, it will drown you. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the air into my tight chest. Panic was a weakness. I needed strength. I needed information. I needed someone who knew the world Robert had truly inhabited, the world of whispers and shadows that existed just beneath the placid surface of Charleston society. There was only one name that came to mind: Frank Miller. Frank had been a police detective back in the day, a good one, until the bureaucracy and the politics wore him down. He'd quit the force and opened a private investigation firm. Robert had used him occasionally for what he called due diligence. Vetting new hires, checking on subcontractors. But I always suspected the work was sometimes more delicate. Frank was a man who knew how to find things people didn't want found. He'd retired years ago, around the same time Robert passed. The last I heard, he was living out on John's Island, keeping bees. Finding his number wasn't easy. It wasn't in my address book of friends and relatives. I had to go back into Robert's desk, to an old, worn Rolodex. And there it was, under M. Miller, Frank, with a number and no other description. Discretion was the bedrock of their relationship. I carried the phone from the kitchen into the office and closed the door. My hand was trembling as I dialed. It felt like I was crossing a line, stepping out of my quiet, sun-drenched world and into the murky one my husband had shielded me from. The phone rang 4 times, each ring a jangling nerve in the silence. I was about to hang up when a gruff, gravelly voice answered. "Yeah? Is this Frank Miller?" I asked, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. There was a pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm Robert Vance's widow." The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. I could hear the faint, distant buzzing of bees. For a moment, I thought he'd hung up. "Eleanor," he finally said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Well, I'll be damned. It's been a long time. I was sorry to hear about Robert." "Thank you, Frank. It's kind of you to say." I took a breath. Small talk was a waste of time we didn't have. "I'm calling because I need your help. It's about something from the past. Something to do with Robert's business." The past is a damn heavy thing to go digging in, Eleanor. Most times, it's better left buried. "I don't have that choice," I said, and the conviction in my voice surprised even me. "The past isn't staying buried. It's crawling out of the grave and into my living room." That got his attention. "What's the trouble?" I chose my words carefully. I couldn't tell him everything, about the slap, about David's debt. He would see it as a domestic squabble. I had to frame it in a language he and Robert would have understood: business. A threat. I was going through some of Robert's old papers, I lied smoothly. And I came across a name. "I have reason to believe this person might cause some trouble for my family. His name is Marcus Thorne." Another pause. The buzzing of the bees seemed to get louder. "Thorne," Frank repeated. The name was flat, devoid of surprise. He knew it. "Son of Leonard Thorne." "Yes," I said, my knuckles white on the receiver. "That's the one." "He's not in the construction game like his old man was," Frank said, his voice turning clinical, the old detective resurfacing. "He's a vulture of a different breed. Private equity, high-interest loans. He buys up distressed debt and squeezes till there's nothing left. Got a reputation for being vindictive. Especially with anyone connected to his father's generation." Everything he said was a nail in the coffin of my denial. "I need to know everything about him," I said. "What he's doing, who he's involved with, and why he would suddenly take an interest in the Vance family after all these years." "Eleanor, this isn't a good idea," Frank warned. "Guys like Marcus Thorne, they don't play by the old rules. They're messier." Louder. "If he's sniffing around you, there's a reason. A reason you probably don't want to know." "Knowing is the only weapon I have, Frank," I insisted. My son and his wife are in my house, and they are terrified. I can't protect them if I'm blind." "Robert, he always paid you for your discretion." "This ain't about money," he grumbled. It's about stirring up a hornet's nest. But, he sighed, a long, weary sound. Robert was a son of a bitch, but he was good to me. Pulled my bacon out of the fire more than once. All right, Eleanor. I'll make some calls. See what the buzz is. But you be careful. Vultures can smell weakness a mile away. I'm not weak, I said, looking at the damning ledger on the desk. I'm just finding my footing. He grunted in what might have been agreement. I'll call you in a day or two. Don't call me. And Eleanor? Don't trust anyone. Not even your own family, if they're scared. Scared people do stupid things. He hung up. I slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. The office felt colder now. Frank's warning echoed in the silence. He was right. Amelia, in her terror, had struck me. David, in his fear, was hiding from me. I was alone in this. An 82-year-old woman with a buried key, a secret ledger, and a ghost for an ally. And I was about to go to war with a vulture. The waiting was a unique form of torture. For 2 days, I existed in a state of suspended animation, every ring of the phone sending a jolt through my nervous system. I maintained the facade of my routine, pruning the roses, writing my letters, but it was a hollow performance. My mind was elsewhere, sifting through the gritty details in the green ledger, rehearsing conversations with Frank Miller that hadn't happened yet. The tension in the house had become a physical presence. It was in the way David flinched when a car drove past, the way Amelia's fork scraped against her plate at dinner, a sound as grating as nails on a chalkboard. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, and the bars were getting tighter every day. The breaking point came on the third night. I was woken from a shallow, restless sleep by a sound from downstairs. It wasn't a whisper or a footstep. It was the sound of something breaking, a glass, dropped on the kitchen tile. It was followed by a choked, muffled sob. I slipped out of bed, pulling on my thin silk robe. I moved through the darkened house as silently as a memory, my bare feet cool against the polished hardwood floors. The light in the kitchen was on, a stark, unforgiving glare. Amelia was there. She was on her knees amidst the glittering shards of a broken water glass, not even trying to pick them up. Her shoulders were shaking, her head bowed. She was weeping with an abandon that was utterly devastating, the raw, hopeless sobs of someone who had finally reached the end of their rope. I didn't say anything. I just walked to the broom closet, got the dustpan and brush, and began to carefully sweep up the broken glass around her. The small, scraping sounds were the only ones in the room. When the last shard was in the pan, I put it on the counter and filled the kettle with water. I moved with a deliberate, calming rhythm, my actions a silent message, I am here. I am not judging you. I made 2 cups of chamomile tea, placing one on the table in front of the chair she had now collapsed into. She stared at it, her hands wrapped around her elbows as if she were freezing. It was my grandmother's, she whispered, her voice hoarse. The glass. I know, I said softly. It was a beautiful one. I sat down opposite her. The chasm that the slap had opened between us was still there, but for the first time, a fragile bridge was being extended across it. We sat in silence as the steam from the teacups rose between us. Finally, she looked at me, her face a wreck of tear tracks and despair. He called again, she said, the words barely audible. Thorn. He knows David has been trying to move assets. He said the time for games is over. He gave us until the end of the week. To give him the car. Or, she couldn't finish the sentence. A fresh wave of tears choked her. Or what, Amelia? I asked, my voice gentle but firm. I had to know the full shape of the monster we were facing. She took a shuddering breath. Or he sends someone to collect the debt from David. In person. He described in detail how he would break his legs, Eleanor. So he'd never walk properly again. He said it was only fair. A builder's son should know what it feels like to be broken. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was personal. It was sadistic. This was not business. This was vengeance. Tell me everything, I said. From the beginning. No more lies. The stress, the business deal. I want the truth. And so, it all came pouring out. The story was as old as time, ambition mixed with naivete. David had a vision for a boutique construction firm, one that built sustainable, eco-friendly homes. He was a good builder, but a poor businessman. He'd needed capital to get started, and the banks were cautious. Then, Marcus Thorne had appeared, like an answer to a prayer. He presented himself as a venture capitalist, an angel investor. He was charming, sharp, and he loved David's vision. He offered them a loan with terms that seemed too good to be true. They were. The project was hit with unforeseen delays, zoning issues, supply chain problems. David fell behind. The interest on Thorne's loan ballooned, compounding at a predatory rate. Soon, they weren't just in debt, they were drowning in it. When they tried to renegotiate, Thorne's charming mask had dropped. He revealed he knew exactly who David was. The son of Robert Vance. The man who had ruined his father. He doesn't just want to ruin us, Eleanor, Amelia wept, her hands twisting in her lap. He wants to humiliate us. He wants to take the last thing your husband owned. He's obsessed with it. He rambles about it on the phone. About how Robert cheated his father, how he hid the proof, documents, account numbers, something, in that car. He thinks it's his birthright. His justice. I listened, my face impassive, my mind cold and clear. Her confession confirmed everything I had pieced together from the ledger and my own intuition. They had walked straight into a trap, one that had been set 35 years ago. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, the question devoid of accusation. Amelia finally met my eyes, and what I saw there was a deep, corrosive shame. We were so embarrassed, she whispered. We had failed. David, he idolized his father. He wanted to live up to his name. To tell you that he'd lost everything, that he'd been so stupid, it was more than he could bear. And I was supposed to be his partner. I supported this. I encouraged him. She looked down at her hands. And when Thorne mentioned the car, we thought, maybe we could just give it to him. That it was just a piece of metal. That you wouldn't have to know how badly we'd messed up. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. For everything. For hitting you. I was so scared, I wasn't thinking. I reached across the table and placed my old, wrinkled hand over her two young, trembling ones. They were ice cold. Fear makes people do things they don't recognize, I said. But the time for fear is over. The time for secrets is over. Her confession hadn't burdened me. It had armed me. I now knew the enemy's motive, his tactics, and his deadline. He had made a critical mistake. He thought he was fighting David, a gentle man he could easily break. He thought he was dealing with Amelia, a panicked woman he could terrorize. He had no idea he was really fighting me. The next day dawned gray and oppressive, the Charleston sky the color of unpolished silver. The air was thick with the promise of a storm. Amelia's confession had changed the atmosphere in the house. The frantic, secret energy was gone, replaced by a heavy, shared dread. They looked to me now, not as an elderly parent to be protected, but as a commander whose orders they awaited. They didn't know I was just as lost as they were, armed only with a dead man's secrets and a prayer that a beekeeper on John's Island would call. The call came just after noon. The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet house, making both David and Amelia jump. I picked it up in the kitchen, my back to them, and spoke a single word. Hello? It's a bad hive, Eleanor, Frank Miller's gravelly voice said without preamble. The kind you burn, not the kind you try to save. My grip tightened on the receiver. Tell me. Marcus Thorne is worse than I thought, he began, his voice low and urgent. He's not just a loan shark, he's a collector of grudges. He spent his 20s digging into his father's death. Became a damn obsession. He's convinced Robert Vance either pushed his old man off that scaffolding or arranged to have it happen, then used some legal sleight of hand to absorb Leonard's share of the company. The official story, accidental death, never sat right with him. Or anyone else, if they were being honest. I looked at the closed door of Robert's office. Resolved. Permanently. Is there any proof? I asked, my voice a dry whisper. Never was, Frank said. No witnesses who'd talk. The foreman on that site retired to Florida, a millionaire a year later. The police report was thin. Robert had friends in high places, you know that. He could make paperwork disappear. For Marcus, the lack of proof is the proof. He believes your husband was smart enough to hide the evidence of the buyout, the real partnership agreements, the doctored financials, somewhere no one would ever look. Not in a bank, not in his office. Somewhere personal. The Buick, I breathed. Bingo, Frank confirmed. He's been telling anyone who'll listen for years. It's his white whale. He thinks finding those papers won't just make him rich, it'll vindicate his father's memory. It'll prove he wasn't a failure who fell off a beam, but a victim. The storm outside was getting closer. A low rumble of thunder vibrated through the floorboards. He's squeezed your son, hasn't he? Frank asked. It wasn't a question. That's what this is about. I pulled some credit reports. David Vance is leveraged to the hilt. Thorne holds all the paper. He threatened to hurt him, Frank. Badly. There was a grim silence on the line. I could hear him breathing. I believe it. This isn't just business for him, Eleanor. It's biblical. An eye for an eye. A son for a son. He's trying to destroy David to get back at Robert. And he's using the car as the lever. I closed my eyes. The full, monstrous weight of it settled on me. This wasn't about a debt my son had incurred. This was about a blood feud he had inherited. David and Amelia weren't just victims of a bad loan, they were pawns in a ghost's revenge fantasy. What can I do, Frank? I asked, my voice stripped of all its earlier strength. The police? He gave a short, bitter laugh. And say what? A man is trying to collect on a legal, if predatory, loan? That he's saying mean things on the phone? They won't do a thing until after someone gets hurt. And guys like Thorne, they have expensive lawyers who can tie this up in civil court for a decade. He's insulated. He was right. We were trapped. Thorne had built a perfect cage of legality and intimidation around us. Any move we made would be seen as a debtor trying to evade payment. Any plea for help would sound like a paranoid fantasy. So we give him the car? I asked, the words tasting like ash. Might be your only play, Frank admitted, and I could hear the reluctance in his voice. Give the man his damn trophy. Let him tear it apart. When he finds nothing, maybe he loses interest. Or maybe, he added, his voice darkening, it makes him angrier. More convinced you're hiding something. It's a gamble. The first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the kitchen window. The storm had arrived. Thank you, Frank, I said quietly. You've given me what I needed to know. Eleanor, listen to me, he said, his voice urgent. Don't try to be a hero. Robert played in the mud. You never had to. Don't start now. Some fights, the only way to win is to walk away. I hung up the phone. The quiet click of the receiver echoed in the kitchen. David and Amelia were standing in the doorway, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. What did he say, Mom? David asked. I looked at my son. My gentle, kind son, who wanted to build beautiful things and had been caught in the ugly machinery of his father's past. I looked at Amelia, who had been pushed to violence by a terror she couldn't contain. Frank was wrong. Walking away wasn't winning. It was a deferred loss. Thorne wouldn't stop with the car. A man this obsessed, this full of hate, would never stop. He would take the car, find nothing, and then he would come back for his payment in flesh and bone. He would break my son, just as he promised. I looked from their faces to the closed door of Robert's office. No. We would not run. We would not hide. We would not give him the car. We would set a trap of our own. Get your coats, I said, my voice as calm and steady as the rain that was now lashing against the house. We're not going to wait for him to come to us. We're going to him. David and Amelia stared at me as if I'd just announced I was taking up professional wrestling. The idea of confronting Marcus Thorne was so contrary to their instincts for flight and concealment that they couldn't process it. Mom, what are you talking about? David asked, taking a hesitant step forward. Go to him? Frank just said. Frank Miller is a good man, but he thinks like a detective, I cut in, my voice sharp and clear, leaving no room for argument. He sees the board as it is. I'm seeing the board as it could be. Right now, Thorne has all the power. He's the predator, we're the prey. He controls the narrative, the timing, the fear. We are going to change that. I motioned for them to follow me into the living room, the one that had been the site of our family's rupture just days before. Now, it would be our war room. I sat in my usual armchair, the place where I read and did my needlepoint. The familiarity of it grounded me. I was still Eleanor Vance, but I was also someone else now. I was Robert's wife, in a way I had never been when he was alive. I was thinking like him. Sit, I commanded. They sat on the sofa opposite me, perched on the edge of the cushions like nervous birds. First, you need to understand the man your father was, I began, looking directly at David. He wasn't just a builder. He was a fighter. He was ruthless when he had to be. He built this family's security on a foundation that wasn't always clean. I spent 50 years turning a blind eye to the dirt on his hands because I was comfortable and I was safe. That time is over. The legacy he left us isn't just this house and his reputation. It's this fight. It's Marcus Thorne. David flinched, the truth of it a physical blow. Amelia reached out and took his hand. Thorne believes there are documents in the Buick, I continued, my mind working with a crystalline clarity. Proof that Robert cheated his father. He's obsessed. His entire life has been built around this story of victimhood and revenge. An obsession like that is not a strength. It's a weakness. It's a blind spot. And we are going to use it against him. I leaned forward, my old bones creaking in protest. He is expecting you to be scared. He is expecting you to run, to hide, to beg. He is not expecting me. He is not expecting an 82-year-old woman to invite him into her home for a civilized conversation. You're going to call him? Amelia whispered, horrified. I am, I said. And I am going to offer him exactly what he wants. Not the car. Something better. The truth. My plan began to unfold in the quiet, rain-lashed living room. It was audacious, dangerous, and it relied entirely on my ability to read a man I had never met. It was a poker game where I was bluffing with an empty hand. Here is what we are going to do, I said, my gaze locking with each of them in turn, forcing them to see my conviction. David, I need you to go to the bank first thing in the morning. I have a safe deposit box there. It hasn't been opened since your father died. I need you to retrieve the contents for me. What's in it? David asked. Memories, I said, which was not a lie. And a very official-looking, very old key. Amelia, I continued, turning to her. I need you to be my witness. My support. When Thorne comes, you and David will be here. You will not speak unless I ask you to. You will not show fear. You will stand behind me, a united front. You will show him that this family does not break. I could see the doubt warring with a nascent flicker of hope in their eyes. And what's your part, Mom? David asked quietly. My part, I said, a grim smile touching my lips for the first time in days, is to play the grieving, slightly confused widow who has stumbled upon her husband's last secret. I will tell Mr. Thorne that I found something in Robert's office. Something that corroborates his story. I will tell him that my husband, in a fit of sentimentality or guilt, couldn't bring himself to destroy the final evidence of his dealings with Leonard Thorne. But there is no evidence, Amelia said, confused. The ledger, you can't show him that. Of course not, I said. What I will show him is much more powerful than a piece of paper. I will show him a key. An old, rusty key to a bank box that no longer exists. And I will tell him that inside that box is everything he's ever dreamed of. The original partnership agreement. The proof of his father's ownership. The justice he so desperately craves. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the drumming of the rain. They were beginning to understand. It's a lie, David breathed, a look of awe on his face. It is a story, I corrected him. And Marcus Thorne is its most eager audience. He wants to believe it so badly that he will make it true in his own mind. I will give him that key in exchange for one thing, the signed and notarized forgiveness of your debt, and his word that he will never contact our family again. He'll never agree, Amelia protested. He'll just take the key and come after us anyway. He will agree, I said with utter certainty. Because his greed for revenge is greater than his greed for your money. He wants to be right more than he wants to be rich. I am giving him the ultimate prize, the chance to prove to the world, and to himself, that he was right all along. And I will give him the Buick, too. As a bonus. A trophy for his victory. I leaned back in my chair, the plan settled, solid and heavy, in my mind. It was a terrible gamble. If my reading of Marcus Thorne was wrong, if his sadism outweighed his obsession, then we would lose everything. But as I looked at the faces of my son and his wife, I saw the terror being slowly replaced by a fragile, dangerous hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, they weren't victims. They were conspirators. Now, I said, my voice as calm as if I were asking them to pass the sugar. Let's find Mr. Thorne's phone number. Finding Marcus Thorne's number was unsettlingly easy. He wasn't hiding. His firm, Thorne Capital, was listed online, complete with a sleek, minimalist website showcasing an office of glass and steel that looked nothing like the world of mud and concrete his father had inhabited. There was a direct line. He was a predator who liked to be seen. I made the call the next morning. David had already gone to the bank, his face a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Amelia hovered near me in the kitchen, twisting a tea towel in her hands. I waved her away. I had to do this alone. My voice had to be perfect. I dialed the number. A crisp, professional female voice answered. Thorne Capital. I would like to speak to Mr. Marcus Thorne, please, I said, allowing a slight, elderly tremble to enter my voice. My name is Eleanor Vance. I knew my name would be a flag. There was a pause, a muffled sound, and then a new voice came on the line. It was smooth, confident, and cold as chilled whiskey. Mrs. Vance. This is a surprise. Mr. Thorne, I said, keeping my tone polite, frail. I do hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, he said, and I could hear the smug curiosity in his voice. He was toying with me, the cat with the cornered mouse. To what do I owe the honor? I'm calling about the unfortunate business between you and my son, I began. There has been a great deal of distress in my home. A misunderstanding, I think. I believe I have found something that may clarify the situation. Something that belonged to my husband. I let the silence hang for a moment. Let him imagine what it could be. Go on, he said, his voice sharper now, the feigned politeness gone. I believe a face-to-face conversation would be more appropriate than a telephone call, I said. These are sensitive matters. I would like to invite you to my home, for tea, perhaps? This afternoon? To discuss a final and amicable resolution. The line went silent. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. A trap? An old woman's ramblings? Or the breakthrough he'd been waiting for his entire life? His obsession, I gambled, would win out over his caution. The sheer domesticity of the invitation, tea at the home of his enemy's widow, would be too bizarre, too surreal to be a credible threat. Tea, he repeated, a note of incredulous amusement in his voice. I make an excellent lemon pound cake, I said sweetly. He was quiet for another 10 seconds. Very well, Mrs. Vance, he finally said. I'm an accommodating man. What time? Shall we say 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock it is, he said, and hung up. I replaced the receiver, my hand steady. The first part of the gambit was complete. He had taken the bait. The next few hours were a strange, surreal performance of domesticity. Amelia, her nervous energy now channeled, helped me dust the living room and polish the silver teapot. I went into the kitchen and began the familiar, comforting ritual of baking. I measured the flour, zested the lemons, creamed the butter and sugar. My hands, which had trembled holding the phone, were now steady. Each movement was precise, automatic. As I worked, I wasn't just baking a cake. I was preparing a stage. Every detail had to be perfect. The scent of baking lemon and melting butter that would fill the house was not just a welcome aroma, it was a prop, designed to create an atmosphere of harmless, elderly civility. David returned from the bank an hour later. He placed a small, surprisingly heavy metal box on the kitchen table. Inside, nestled amongst my marriage certificate and Robert's old army medals, was a single, large, ornate iron key. It was from a trust company that had gone out of business in the 1980s. The key was a relic, completely useless, attached to a brass tag with a number stamped on it. It was perfect. It looked important. It looked like it unlocked a secret. We rehearsed. I made David and Amelia stand in the living room, behind my chair. You are a wall, I told them. You are my silent, unwavering support. He will try to provoke you, especially you, David. He will insult your father's memory. You will not react. Your silence will be your strength. Do you understand? They both nodded, their faces grim. At 2:30, I arranged the tea service on a silver tray, my best porcelain cups, the creamer, the sugar bowl, a plate of thinly sliced lemon. The pound cake sat on a crystal platter, golden and fragrant. Everything looked beautiful. Civilized. A perfect picture of Southern hospitality. At 10 minutes to 3, I took the old iron key and placed it on the small table next to my armchair, partially concealed by a lace doily. The doorbell rang at precisely 3 o'clock. My heart gave a single, hard thud against my ribs. I looked at David and Amelia, who stood pale and rigid by the fireplace. I gave them a small, sharp nod. Showtime. I walked to the door, my movements calm and measured. I took a deep breath and opened it. Marcus Thorne was not what I had expected. He was younger, perhaps in his late 40s, and dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked more like an extension of his body than clothing. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, with cold, intelligent eyes and a smile that never touched them. He held a slim leather briefcase. He looked utterly out of place on my welcoming front porch, a hawk in a canary cage. Mrs. Vance, he said, his smile widening slightly. I smell lemon cake. Mr. Thorne, I replied, my own smile equally placid. Please, do come in. He stepped inside, and the atmosphere in the house shifted immediately. It was as if the temperature dropped 10 degrees. He moved with a slick, contained confidence, his cold eyes taking in everything at once, the grandfather clock, the family photos, the worn oriental rug. He was assessing, calculating. He was not a guest, he was an inspector. His gaze landed on David and Amelia, standing stone-faced by the fireplace. A flicker of something, triumph, perhaps, crossed his face. He nodded at them, a gesture of dismissive acknowledgement. David. Amelia, he said, his voice smooth as silk. Good of you to be here for the surrender. David's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Amelia's hand shot out and gripped his arm, a silent reminder of their promise. They said nothing. Their silence was a small, solid victory. Mr. Thorne, please, have a seat, I said, gesturing to the armchair opposite mine. Can I offer you some tea? I'm not here for social niceties, Mrs. Vance, he said, though he did sit, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, all coiled energy and impatience. You said you had something for me. I sat down in my own chair, the familiar cushions a comfort to my back. I felt strangely calm. I was no longer an 82-year-old woman. I was a player in a high-stakes game, and the board was my living room. All in good time, I said, pouring the tea with a steady hand. The clink of porcelain against porcelain was the only sound. It is a civilized house. We will be civilized. Cream? Sugar? He waved a hand impatiently. I poured a cup for myself and took a small, deliberate sip. I would control the pace. This would be done on my terms. You remind me of him, you know, I said conversationally, setting the cup down. My Robert. He had that same intensity. The same belief that the world would bend to his will if he just pushed hard enough. Thorne's eyes narrowed. Don't compare me to that thief. Thief is a strong word, I said, my voice gentle. He was a complicated man. He built half of this city. He provided a good life for his family. But he was also pragmatic. He believed that sometimes, for the greater good, the rules had to be bent. He didn't bend the rules, Thorne hissed, the veneer of calm cracking. He broke them. He broke my father. He took everything from him and left him to die. Yes, I said, and the simple affirmation stunned him into silence. He had expected denial, argument. I was giving him agreement. I believe you're right. I let that sink in. I looked at him with an expression of weary, sad acceptance. I have lived in this house for 60 years, Mr. Thorne. I lived a life of comfort, and I chose not to look at the foundations it was built upon. After my husband died, I found some of his old records. Things he kept hidden. It seems your father was not his only, unresolved matter. I leaned over and picked up the old iron key from under the doily. I held it in my palm. It was heavy, real. He was a sentimental man, in his own strange way, I continued, my voice taking on a confidential, almost confessional tone. He couldn't bring himself to destroy everything. A kind of monument to his own sins, perhaps. He kept it all. The original partnership contracts for the Seabrook parcel. The real financial statements. Everything that would prove your father's stake. Thorne's eyes were locked on the key. He was barely breathing. His life's obsession was manifesting right before his eyes, held in the wrinkled palm of an old woman. He didn't hide it in the Buick, I said with a small, sad laugh. Robert was never that obvious. He locked it all away. In a place no one would ever think to look. I held the key out to him. This is the key to that place. A bank vault. It contains everything you've been looking for. The proof. Your justice. He didn't move. His mind was working, searching for the trick, the angle. Why, he finally asked, his voice rough. Why would you give this to me? Because my son is not my husband, I said, my gaze flickering to David. My son is a good man who has been caught in a war he didn't start. I am tired of the ghosts of the past destroying the future. I want this to be over. I want my family to have peace. I placed the key on the tea table between us. I will give you this key, I said, my voice dropping, becoming as hard as steel. And I will give you the title to the Buick. Your trophy. In exchange, I want the paperwork for my son's loan, marked paid in full. And you will sign a document, which my son has already prepared, stating that you will have no further contact with any member of the Vance family. Ever. He stared at the key, then at me. It was a perfect trap. To refuse my offer would be to admit that his quest was never about justice, only about torturing my son. To accept it was to get everything he ever wanted. The documents are in my briefcase, David said, his voice steady and strong for the first time. He stepped forward and laid a small folio on the other end of the table. Thorne was silent for a full minute. He looked from the key to David's folio, then back to my face. He was searching for the lie, but all he could see was an old woman making a desperate bargain to save her family. The story was too compelling. Too perfect. Finally, he reached out and took the key. He examined it, his fingers tracing its rusty, ornate shape. He believed. He opened his briefcase and produced a thick file. He signed the top page with a flourish, then pushed it across the table. He took the document David had prepared and signed that too, without even reading it. His eyes were still on the key. He had his justice. The rest was just business. He stood up. The car, he said. I'll send a flatbed for it this afternoon. The keys are in the ignition, I said. The title is in the glove compartment. He nodded, a sharp, final gesture. He picked up his briefcase, the iron key still clutched in his other hand. He walked to the door without another word, without a backward glance. He had won. The door closed behind him. The three of us stood in the silent living room, the signed documents sitting on the table like a peace treaty. The air was thick with the scent of lemon cake and victory. Amelia was the first to speak, her voice a trembling whisper. Oh my God, Eleanor. You did it. David sank onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with relief. I remained in my chair, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The game was over. I had bluffed the devil himself and won. But the final move was yet to be played. The flatbed truck arrived an hour later. We watched from the living room window as two men winched the old Buick out of the garage. It looked sad and undignified in the harsh afternoon light, a beached whale being dragged away. When it was gone, the empty space in the garage seemed vast, a missing tooth in the smile of the house. I felt a pang, not of loss for the car, but of farewell to the man Robert had been, and the life I had lived with him. That chapter was now, finally, closed. The days that followed were quiet. The oppressive weight of fear had lifted, leaving behind a fragile, tentative peace. David and Amelia began to smile again, real smiles that reached their eyes. They talked about the future, about starting over, smaller this time, wiser. The slap was never mentioned, but its memory was a quiet reminder of how close they had come to the edge. An apology had been made not in words, but in the new, gentle way Amelia would touch my arm, in the deep respect that had replaced fear in my son's eyes. About a week later, Amelia found me sitting on the back porch, watching the sun set behind the live oaks. She sat in the rocking chair beside me, a cup of tea in her hands. I have to ask, Eleanor, she said softly. What was really in that box? I smiled, a slow, secret smile. I looked out at my roses, their petals glowing in the golden light. Nothing, I said. Absolutely nothing. It's been empty for 30 years. Robert closed out that account when the trust company was bought out in the 80s. The key was just a piece of junk he tossed in a box of keepsakes. Amelia stared at me, her mouth slightly open. But Thorne, he'll find out. He'll open it and see it's empty. Won't he come back? Angrier than before? Oh, he will find out it's empty, I agreed. But not for a very, very long time. A man like Marcus Thorne, a man so consumed by a story, can't accept a simple truth. An empty box is an unacceptable ending to his epic tale. He won't believe it. He'll think we tricked him, that we swapped the key, that the bank is hiding something. He will hire lawyers. He will try to get court orders. He will spend a fortune and years of his life trying to prove that something should have been there. He's no longer chasing us, my dear. He is chasing a ghost. He's trapped in a prison of his own making, and that old, rusty key is the lock. I took a sip of my tea. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming night jasmine. For the first time in a long time, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had not erased Robert's sins, but I had paid his debt. I had used his own weapons, cunning, psychology, a deep understanding of human weakness, to protect what he had built. The Buick was gone. The secret ledger was burned, its ashes scattered in my rose garden. The ghosts of the past had been faced, not by a strong man with dirty hands, but by an old woman with a clear mind. I looked down at my own hands, resting in my lap. The skin was thin as paper, etched with the roadmap of my long life. They didn't look like the hands of a fragile old lady anymore. They were the hands of a keeper, a warrior, a queen who had defended her small kingdom against a dragon. I had sacrificed the symbol of my past to give my family a future. The world wasn't perfect, and the foundations of our life were still built on a complicated truth. But the facade was gone, replaced by something stronger, something more honest. And in that fragile, hard-won honesty, there was room to breathe. There was hope.